The gunshot echoed through the snow-covered mansion just as Choi Tae-yoon's eyes locked on her across the crowded ballroom. She stood frozen near the champagne tower, her emerald dress clinging to curves that made his carefully controlled world tilt sideways. Blood dripped from his knuckles onto marble floors while chaos erupted around them, but all he could see was her, terrified and beautiful, staring back at him like she could see straight through the monster everyone feared to the man no one knew existed. Something ancient and inevitable clicked into place in his chest, a recognition that felt like coming home and falling off a cliff simultaneously. He'd killed men for less than a glance, but this woman with her wide brown eyes and trembling hands made him want to drop to his knees and swear an oath he didn't understand. Welcome to Afrokorean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The Christmas party at the Hanamdong estate was supposed to be a simple business obligation, another tedious evening of fake smiles and careful alliances for Choi Tae-yoon, the man who controlled Seoul's underground with an iron fist wrapped in Armani suits. At 34 he'd built an empire on fear and precision, every move calculated, every emotion buried so deep even he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. His reputation preceded him like winter fog, cold and suffocating, the kind of man whose name made hardened criminals cross themselves and pray. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, whiskey in hand, watching his associates mingle and scheme while classical music played softly through hidden speakers. The mansion belonged to one of his legitimate business fronts, a pharmaceutical company that laundered more money than it produced medicine, and tonight's gathering was meant to smooth over tensions with some visiting Japanese investors who didn't know they were shaking hands with the devil himself. Tae-yoon's second-in-command, Im Woo-jin, appeared at his elbow with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd survived 15 years in the organization by knowing exactly when to speak and when to disappear. Boss, the Tanaka delegation just arrived. They brought 3 extra security men despite our agreement about numbers. Tae-yoon's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his displeasure, his dark eyes scanning the entrance where a group of suited Japanese men were being greeted by the hostess he'd hired for the evening. Have our men ready but keep them invisible. If Tanaka wants to play games we'll show him what happens to people who test my patience, but not tonight. Tonight we smile and pretend we're all civilized. Woo-jin nodded and melted back into the crowd, leaving Tae-yoon alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable sensation that something about this evening felt different, charged somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm. That's when he saw her. She emerged from the catering entrance near the east wing, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, moving with an unconscious grace that made every other woman in the room fade into insignificance. Her skin was deep brown, luminous against the emerald silk dress that hugged curves he shouldn't be noticing, not here, not now, not ever if he wanted to maintain the control that kept him alive. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant style that exposed the vulnerable curve of her neck, and when she smiled at a guest who took a glass from her tray, the expression transformed her face into something that made Tae-yoon's carefully guarded heart stutter in his chest. She was clearly part of the catering staff, probably hired through the agency he used for these events, but there was something about the way she moved through the crowd that suggested she didn't quite belong in this world of champagne and conspiracy. He couldn't stop watching her. It was irrational and dangerous and completely unlike him, but his eyes tracked her across the ballroom like a predator following prey, except the sensation churning in his gut had nothing to do with hunting and everything to do with a hunger he'd denied himself for so long he'd forgotten it existed. She moved between guests with professional efficiency, offering drinks and canapés, her smile polite but distant, never meeting anyone's eyes for more than a second. Smart girl, he thought, knowing instinctively that prolonged eye contact in a room full of criminals was an invitation to trouble. But then some drunk associate of the Tanaka group grabbed her wrist as she passed, pulling her close and saying something that made her face tighten with barely concealed disgust. Tae-yoon was moving before his brain caught up with his body. He crossed the ballroom in long strides that made people instinctively step aside, that particular quality of controlled violence he carried making them recognize a predator in motion. The drunk Japanese man still had his hand on her wrist when Tae-yoon arrived, and the look on her face, that mixture of fear and determination to stay professional, made something protective and primal roar to life in his chest. I suggest you remove your hand, Tae-yoon said in perfectly accented Japanese, his voice so cold the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, or I'll remove it for you along with the rest of your arm. The man looked up, recognition dawning slowly through his alcohol haze, and his face went pale as snow when he realized who he was talking to. He released her wrist like it burned him and stumbled backward with a stream of apologies that Taeyoon ignored completely because his attention had shifted to the woman rubbing her wrist with shaking hands. Their eyes met for the first time and the world stopped. She had the most expressive eyes he'd ever seen, deep brown and filled with wariness that told him she'd learned to be careful around powerful men. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight American accent that explained why she looked so uncomfortable in this very Korean setting. "I'm fine, really, he was just drunk." Taeyoon found himself staring at her mouth as she spoke, the full curve of her lips, the slight tremor that betrayed how not fine she actually was. "What's your name?" he asked, the question coming out rougher than intended, less request than demand. She hesitated, clearly debating whether answering was wise, and something about that hesitation made him want to reassure her even as another part of him wanted to command her obedience. "I'm Naomi," she finally said. "I work for the catering company. I should probably get back to the kitchen before my supervisor notices I'm missing." But she didn't move and neither did he, trapped in that strange suspended moment where the party continued around them but they existed in a bubble of tension he couldn't name. "You're American," Taeyoon said, statement not question, watching color rise in her cheeks. "Korean American actually," she corrected, looking down at her tray. "My parents moved to Seoul when I was 14 but I grew up in New York. I'm just working this party to help pay off some debt. This isn't my usual life." He didn't know why but that admission, that small vulnerability, made his protective instincts surge even stronger. "Stay away from the Tanaka group," he told her, keeping his voice low. "They're dangerous men and you're too beautiful to be safe around them. If anyone bothers you again, find me immediately." Her eyes widened at the casual way he'd called her beautiful, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed, the gesture so innocently sensual it took all his control not to trace the movement with his fingers. Before either could speak again, the sound of raised voices cut through the classical music. Taeyoon's head snapped toward the commotion, years of survival instincts kicking in, and he saw Tanaka himself arguing with one of Taeyoon's men near the entrance to the private study. "This is bad," he muttered, then looked at Naomi with an intensity that made her take an instinctive step back. "Go to the kitchen and stay there until the party ends. Don't come back out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" She nodded, clearly confused but smart enough to recognize genuine concern when she heard it, and he watched her hurry toward the service corridor before turning his attention to the brewing situation with Tanaka. The next few minutes unfolded with the brutal efficiency of violence Taeyoon had perfected over 15 years. Tanaka's accusation that Taeyoon had been skimming profits from their joint ventures was both false and deliberately inflammatory, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever move the Japanese were planning. Taeyoon remained ice-cold through the confrontation, his voice never rising above conversational level even as Tanaka's face turned red with manufactured rage. The breaking point came when Tanaka made the mistake of threatening Taeyoon's family, a line no one crossed and lived to tell about, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next Taeyoon's fist connected with Tanaka's jaw with enough force to drop the older man to the marble floor. Chaos erupted instantly. Tanaka's security moved forward but found themselves blocked by Taeyoon's men who'd materialized from the shadows with weapons drawn, and suddenly the elegant Christmas party transformed into a standoff between two criminal organizations with enough firepower to level the building. Taeyoon stood over Tanaka's prone form, blood dripping from his split knuckles onto pristine white marble, his face an expressionless mask that somehow conveyed more menace than any theatrical display of anger could have managed. "You come into my house," he said quietly, deadly, "and threaten my family over money you stole yourself. You insult my honor and waste my hospitality. I should kill you right now and send your head back to Tokyo as a message about what happens to liars and thieves." That's when the first gunshot rang out. One of Tanaka's men, younger and stupider than the rest, panicked and fired at the ceiling, probably trying to break the tension but only succeeding in escalating everything to the point of no return. Return fire came instantly from Taeyoon's security, controlled and precise, taking out the shooter's knee rather than killing him outright because Taeyoon's rules about unnecessary death were ironclad. But in the confusion of screaming guests and overturned furniture, in the smoke and chaos and terror, Taeyoon's eyes found her. Naomi stood frozen near the champagne tower, having apparently ignored his order to stay in the kitchen, her emerald dress a beacon in the monochrome panic of fleeing bodies. Their eyes locked across the ballroom and something fundamental shifted in Taeyoon's carefully constructed world. She should have been just another civilian in danger, someone to protect as collateral rather than priority, but the spike of pure terror that shot through him when he saw her standing there in the line of potential fire was unlike anything he'd experienced. It was personal and possessive and completely irrational, this overwhelming need to get to her, to shield her with his own body, to eliminate every threat between them until she was safe in his arms. He moved without thinking, crossing the distance in powerful strides while barking orders for his men to secure the exits and contain the situation, but his focus never wavered from Naomi's terrified face. He reached her just as another shot rang out, this one closer, and his arms came around her waist pulling her down behind the dubious shelter of an overturned serving table. His body covered hers completely, one hand cradling her head against his chest while the other remained free to reach for the weapon holstered at his back. She was trembling against him, her fingers clutching his jacket, and he could feel her heart racing like a trapped bird. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling back just enough to scan her for injuries, his hands running over her arms and shoulders with professional efficiency that couldn't quite hide the underlying tenderness. "Tell me if you're hurt." "I'm okay," she managed, her voice shaking but stronger than he expected. "What's happening? Why are people shooting? Who are you really?" The question hung between them loaded with implications. Around them the situation was being contained with military precision, Tanaka's men disarmed and restrained, the traitorous shooter receiving medical attention while being zip-tied by Woo Jin's team, guests being herded towards safe exits by security who'd appeared from hidden positions throughout the mansion. But in their small bubble behind the overturned table, with her pressed against him and his arms creating a cage around her body, Taeyoon faced a choice he'd never had to make before. Lying would be easier and safer, maintaining the fiction of legitimate businessman, but looking into her eyes he found he couldn't do it, couldn't start whatever this was with deception. "I'm someone very dangerous," he said quietly, honestly, "and you should probably be afraid of me, but right now I need you to trust me long enough to get you out of here safely. Can you do that?" She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he possessed anymore, then slowly she nodded. He helped her to her feet, keeping his body between her and the rest of the room, and guided her toward a private exit that led to his personal quarters. Behind them Woo Jin was handling cleanup with practiced ease, coordinating with the police contacts on Taeyoon's payroll to ensure the incident would be written up as a security malfunction rather than what it actually was, but Taeyoon's attention remained fixed on the woman whose hand he'd somehow ended up holding. His private suite occupied the top floor of the mansion, a space few people ever entered and fewer left with memories intact. The decor was austere, expensive but impersonal, the rooms of a man who lived there but never really existed anywhere. He brought her to the sitting area and poured her a measure of expensive brandy with hands that were completely steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Drink this," he ordered gently, watching her sink into the leather sofa with a dazed expression. "It'll help with the shock." She accepted the glass automatically, her fingers brushing his in a moment of contact that sent electricity racing up his arm, and he had to force himself to step back rather than doing what every instinct screamed at him to do, which was pull her close and never let go. "Who are you really?" she asked again, her voice steadier now as the brandy did its work, warming color back into her face. Taeyoon sat across from her, maintaining careful distance, and for the first time in 15 years considered telling someone the unvarnished truth about what he was. "My name is Choi Taeyoon and I control most of the organized crime in Seoul," he said, watching her eyes widen. "I run everything from the docks to the corporate boardrooms, drugs, weapons, money laundering. If it's illegal and profitable I probably have a hand in it." The party downstairs was a business meeting with some Japanese associates who decided to test my patience. What you witnessed was the consequence of that miscalculation. He waited for her to panic, to demand he let her leave, to look at him with the fear and disgust he'd seen in countless eyes over the years. Instead she just sat there processing, her intelligent eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed in ways violence never could. "That man who grabbed me," she said slowly, "he works for you or for them." For them, Taeyoon answered, which is why I wanted to break his arm but couldn't without causing an international incident. You have no idea how much restraint that took. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, surprising him. So you're telling me you're some kind of criminal kingpin who just happened to save a random catering girl from a drunk businessman? Not random, he said before he could stop himself, the words emerging with an honesty that felt dangerous. Nothing about you is random. I saw you the moment you walked into that ballroom and I haven't been able to look away since. The admission hung in the air between them, too raw and too real for the practiced seduction he'd employed in the past on the rare occasions he bothered with women. Naomi's breath caught audibly and he watched her pupils dilate, a physical response she couldn't control that told him whatever this pull was between them, he wasn't experiencing it alone. I should be terrified of you, she whispered, and I am, but I'm also something else I don't have a name for. Is that crazy? Is there something wrong with me for not running away from this? Nothing's wrong with you, Taeyoon said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. You're just smart enough to recognize that I would never hurt you. I don't know why I'm so certain of that when I barely know your last name, but I am. You could test me in every way possible and I would never raise a hand to you. You're safe with me, Naomi, safer than you've probably been in a very long time. How do you know that? She challenged, her eyes narrowing. You don't know anything about my life. I know you're working a catering job to pay off debt when you should be doing something that makes better use of that sharp mind I can see working behind your eyes, he said. I know you moved back to Seoul, which suggests family trouble because no American-raised Korean comes back voluntarily unless they have to. I know you flinch slightly when men touch you without permission, which means someone hurt you in the past and taught you to be careful. And I know that despite every logical reason to be afraid right now you're still sitting here talking to me, which means you feel it too. This thing neither of us can explain. The accuracy of his observations made her hands tighten around the brandy glass, and he watched her internal struggle play out across her expressive face, fear warring with curiosity warring with something that looked dangerously close to attraction. My father gambled away everything we had, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He died 6 months ago and left me with his debts to some very unpleasant people. I came back to Seoul because I thought I could earn enough to pay them off and start over. I'd been working 3 jobs and living in a basement apartment in Gangnam. The catering company pays the best, which is why I took this job even though I knew it would be full of exactly the kind of powerful men I've learned to avoid. Who do you owe? Taeyoon asked, his voice taking on that deadly quiet quality that made hardened criminals confess sins they'd forgotten committing. She told him a name that made his jaw clench with recognition, a mid-level loan shark who operated in Gangnam preying on desperate immigrants and gambling addicts, someone who existed in the gray area between legitimate business and Taeyoon's world, not important enough to warrant his attention but annoying enough to make him wish for an excuse to eliminate the problem. How much? He asked. She named a figure that was obscene for someone in her circumstances but pocket change to him. The kind of money he spent on suits or watches without thinking twice. I'll take care of it, he said, standing, watching her eyes go wide with shock. What? No, I can't let you do that. I barely know you and that would make me in debt to someone even more dangerous than the man I currently owe. You wouldn't be in debt to me, Taeyoon corrected, moving closer. Drawn by gravity he couldn't resist. I would be making a gift to someone who interests me. Someone I want to see again without the shadow of debt and fear hanging over her head. Consider it a selfish gesture rather than a generous one because what I want in return is your time, your attention, your willingness to let me take you to dinner and learn everything about you that I don't already know. She stood too, tilting her head back to maintain eye contact, and he was struck again by how perfectly she fit against his height, how natural it felt to have her in his space. This is insane, she said, but her eyes betrayed her. Dark and hungry and fixed on his mouth. You're a criminal. I should be calling the police, not considering having dinner with you, except I can't stop thinking about how you looked at me in that ballroom like I was the only person in the world who mattered, like you would burn down everything around us if it meant keeping me safe. No one's ever looked at me like that before. No one's ever made me feel like this before, he admitted, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew him. Like my carefully controlled world just tilted sideways and the only solid ground is wherever you're standing. I don't do relationships, Naomi. I don't do softness or vulnerability or any of the things that make a man weak in my business, but for you I want to try. I want to be whatever you need even if it terrifies me. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone and she leaned into the touch like a flower towards sun, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. When she opened them again the decision was made, he could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her chin lifted with that particular combination of fear and courage that made his heart ache. "Okay," she said, "one dinner, but somewhere public where you can't murder me and hide the body, and if you're going to pay off my debt I'm going to pay you back even if it takes me 10 years. I won't be bought Choi Tae-yoon, whatever this is between us it has to be real or it's nothing." "Fair enough," he said, fighting a smile at her terms, "though I should warn you I'm very good at getting what I want and what I want is you, not owned or bought but choosing to be mine because nowhere else feels right anymore. I'll give you time to come to that conclusion on your own but I'm not patient by nature so don't make me wait too long." The following morning Tae-yoon's first call was to the loan shark who held Naomi's father's debt. The conversation was brief and entirely one-sided, Tae-yoon's voice carrying the kind of casual menace that needed no theatrical embellishment. "The debt is paid in full plus interest, and you're going to forget that family ever existed. If I hear you've contacted her or anyone connected to her for any reason I will personally remove every finger you've ever used to sign a loan document. Are we clear?" The loan shark, who'd built his business on intimidating desperate people, found himself on the other end of real power and agreed with a speed that would have been comical if Tae-yoon had possessed any sense of humor about threats to Naomi's peace. By noon her debt was erased from every record, physical and digital, and a substantial amount of money had been deposited anonymously into an account in her name because Tae-yoon's idea of taking care of someone involved eliminating not just immediate problems but future vulnerabilities as well. He sent her a text that afternoon, simple and direct. "Your debt is cleared, dinner tonight at 8, I'll pick you up, send me your address." Her response came after a long pause. "You said you'd give me time." "I lied," he typed back, "I'm not good at waiting for things I want. Say yes Naomi, let me feed you and make you smile and prove that not all dangerous men are dangerous to you." Another pause, then an address in Gangnam and a single word. "Okay." Tae-yoon found himself smiling at his phone like some lovesick teenager, an expression that made Woo Jin do a double take when he entered the office moments later. "Boss, are you feeling alright? I've never seen you look so happy, it's actually disturbing." "I have a date," Tae-yoon said, the words foreign on his tongue, "with the woman from last night, which means I need you to handle the Tanaka situation while I'm occupied. Make it clear that any retaliation will be met with overwhelming force but leave the door open for future negotiations once they've had time to remember why crossing me is a bad idea." Woo Jin stared at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. "A date, boss? You haven't been on a date in the entire time I've known you. You have women occasionally but calling it dating would be generous. What's different about this one?" "Everything," Tae-yoon said simply. And because Woo Jin was one of the few people who'd earned his trust through years of loyalty, he continued, "She makes me want to be someone better, someone who could deserve her. I know it's irrational after one conversation but I can't shake the feeling that my entire life has been leading to the moment I saw her in that ballroom, like everything else was just marking time until she appeared." His second-in-command processed this unprecedented confession with the careful consideration of someone who knew when to push and when to accept the inexplicable. "Then I hope she's worth it, boss, because the men who usually inspire this kind of devotion in our world are the ones who end up getting you killed. Just be careful." That evening Tae-yoon found himself doing something he'd never done before, second-guessing his wardrobe choices. He stood in his massive closet surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of designer suits, trying to decide what message he wanted to send. Too formal and he'd look like he was trying to intimidate her. Too casual and she might think he wasn't taking this seriously. He finally settled on black slacks and a charcoal sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent, simple but expensive, the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, someone with anticipation in his eyes instead of the cold calculation that usually resided there. The drive to Gangnam felt longer than usual despite the late evening traffic flowing smoothly. Tae-yoon's fingers drummed against the steering wheel of his Mercedes, an unconscious gesture that betrayed nerves he'd forgotten he could feel. When he pulled up to the address she'd given him, the neighborhood was exactly what he'd expected from her description, modest buildings with tiny apartments stacked like boxes, the kind of place where people worked multiple jobs and still struggled to make rent. He hated knowing she'd been living like this while he existed in luxury, hated that her father's mistakes had cost her so much, hated that he hadn't found her sooner. She emerged from the building wearing a simple black dress that somehow made his mouth go dry, her natural hair styled in soft curls that framed her face, minimal makeup that let her natural beauty shine through. When she spotted his car, her steps faltered slightly, probably recognizing the price tag on the vehicle, but she recovered quickly and approached with that particular mix of wariness and determination he was beginning to recognize as uniquely hers. He got out to open her door, the gesture automatic despite years of being chauffeured everywhere, wanting to do this small thing himself. "You look beautiful," he said, and meant it more than any compliment he'd ever given. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, a hint of humor in her voice as she slid into the passenger seat. "I was half expecting you to show up in tactical gear given what happened last night." "I save that for weekends," he deadpanned, then caught her startled laugh and felt something warm unfold in his chest. The restaurant he'd chosen was exclusive without being ostentatious, a small place in Hanamdong that served the best Korean fusion food in Seoul and never had fewer than 30 security cameras monitoring every entrance. The owner greeted Taeyoon with the deference of someone who knew exactly who he was and wanted to stay alive, leading them to a private room where they could talk without being overheard. Naomi's eyes widened slightly at the setup, but she said nothing, settling into her seat with grace and accepting the menu with a quiet thank you that made the owner visibly relax. Clearly she was having a humanizing effect already. They ordered and Taeyoon found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone, about his childhood in Busan, about the father who'd raised him in this life and the mother who'd tried to save him from it, about the choices that had led him down a path where turning back wasn't possible. She listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she was actually trying to understand rather than just gathering evidence against him. In return she shared her own story, growing up between two cultures, never quite fitting in either, her parents' difficult marriage and eventual divorce, her father's descent into gambling addiction and the shame that came with it, how she'd been studying art history at NYU when everything fell apart and she'd had to abandon her degree to deal with his debts. "You could go back," Taeyoon said, "finish your education, I could make that happen." She shook her head, something sad in her smile. "That life is gone, I'm too old now and too far behind, besides I actually like catering. There's something satisfying about creating beautiful food that brings people together even if it's just for one night." "You have no idea how beautiful you are, do you?" he said, the words escaping before his usual filters could engage. "I don't mean just physically though, you're the most stunning woman I've ever seen, I mean the way you find light in dark situations, the way you turned your father's mistakes into something positive rather than letting it destroy you, the way you're sitting here with someone like me and somehow making me feel human again." Color rose in her cheeks and she looked down at her plate, shy in a way that made him want to kiss her breathless. "I don't know about any of that, I'm just trying to survive and maybe find something that feels like joy occasionally. You make me feel like maybe I could have both." The dinner stretched into hours as they talked, discovering shared loves of classic films and spicy food, arguing playfully about music preferences, the conversation flowing with an ease that suggested years of familiarity rather than hours. When dessert arrived, Taeyoon watched her eyes light up at the elaborate chocolate creation and felt his heart do something uncomfortable in his chest, this overwhelming need to see that expression on her face every day for the rest of his life. They were leaving the restaurant, his hand at the small of her back guiding her through the door, when everything went wrong. A black van screeched to a stop at the curb and men poured out, moving with military precision toward them. Taeyoon's instincts kicked in instantly, he shoved Naomi behind him and reached for the weapon he always carried, but there were too many of them and they were too well coordinated. A blow to his head made his vision swim and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Naomi screaming his name as rough hands dragged her into the van. He woke in what he immediately recognized as one of his own safe houses, which meant someone on his team had found him and brought him home. Woo Jin's face swam into focus above him, worry etched into features that rarely showed emotion. "Boss, thank God, you've been out for 3 hours, we've been searching everywhere but whoever took her knew what they were doing. They disabled all the street cameras in a 6-block radius and dumped your phone so we couldn't track it." "Naomi," Taeyoon croaked, his head pounding but his mind crystal clear with panic, "where is she? Who took her?" We don't know yet, Wu Jin admitted, but we have people shaking down every informant in the city. Whoever did this wanted to hurt you specifically by taking her, which means it's someone who knows how much she matters. Taeyun sat up despite his body's protests, fury and fear churning in his gut in equal measure. I want every resource we have on finding her, call in favors, threaten anyone who might know something. I don't care if we have to burn down half of Seoul to get answers. She's not spending one more minute in the hands of whoever took her. The next 20 hours were the longest of his life. Taeyun operated on adrenaline and rage, personally interrogating leads that went nowhere, his hands bloody from persuasion techniques that made hardened criminals weep. Wu Jin had to physically restrain him twice from killing men who had nothing to do with the kidnapping but happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one of the Tanaka men from the Christmas party, detained since the shooting and eager to trade information for leniency. He revealed that a faction within the Japanese organization had planned the kidnapping as retaliation, targeting Naomi specifically because they'd seen how Taeyun looked at her. They were holding her at a warehouse near the docks, using her as bait to draw him into an ambush. It's a trap, boss, Wu Jin said unnecessarily. They want you to come alone and exposed so they can finish what they started at the party. I don't care, Taeyun said, already checking his weapons. I'm going, and if they hurt her I'll make what happened at the party look like mercy. He took 20 men despite the demand to come alone, positioning them around the warehouse while he approached the main entrance. The Tanaka faction had Naomi tied to a chair in the center of the empty space, her face bruised but her eyes clear and angry rather than terrified. When she saw him her expression transformed into relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. The Japanese men surrounding her were cocky with their numbers, thinking they had the advantage, not realizing they were already dead men walking. Choi Taeyun, the leader called out, "You're predictable, coming for the girl like a lovesick fool. My uncle might be willing to negotiate with you but I prefer more permanent solutions. Tell me what she's worth, your territory, your money, your life." "She's worth everything," Taeyun said simply, his voice carrying across the warehouse, "and you've made a fatal mistake by touching her. I gave you a chance to walk away at the party, now you'll leave here in body bags." The gunfire started instantly, his men pouring in from every entrance with brutal efficiency. Taeyun moved through the chaos like a force of nature, taking down anyone between him and Naomi with cold precision. A bullet grazed his shoulder but he barely felt it, too focused on reaching her. When he finally cut through her bindings she collapsed into his arms, shaking but intact. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his chest, "I knew you'd find me." "Always," he promised, his voice rough with emotion he'd never allowed himself. "I will always find you, always protect you. You're mine now, Naomi, and I protect what's mine with everything I have." The aftermath was handled quickly. Tanaka's nephew wouldn't be causing more problems and the remaining faction was scattered, the message sent clearly to anyone who might consider targeting Taeyun through Naomi again. But in the back of his mind Taeyun knew this was just the beginning. Loving her made her a permanent target, made every enemy see her as his weakness. He took her back to his mansion, refusing to let her out of his sight, and when they reached his private quarters the dam finally broke. She looked up at him with those expressive eyes and he couldn't maintain the distance anymore, his control shattered by 20 hours of imagining her hurt or worse. "I almost lost you," he said, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that belied the violence he'd just committed. "I can't lose you, Naomi. You've become necessary to me in ways I don't fully understand, ways that terrify me because men in my world don't get to keep the things they love, but I'm keeping you anyway. I'm selfish enough and ruthless enough to do whatever it takes to keep you safe even if that means keeping you close enough that leaving becomes impossible." "Then don't let me leave," she whispered, her hands gripping his wrists. "I'm not some delicate flower who needs protecting from reality. I see exactly who you are and what you do and I'm choosing you anyway. I'm choosing this impossible thing between us because nothing in my life has ever felt as right as being with you, so don't push me away out of some misguided attempt to keep me safe. The only thing that would destroy me now is losing you." The kiss that followed was inevitable, desperate, full of fear and relief and hunger they'd both been suppressing. His mouth claimed hers with a possessiveness that should have frightened her but instead made her melt against him, her hands sliding into his hair while his arms banded around her waist pulling her impossibly closer. The kiss deepened, turned incendiary, years of loneliness and isolation combusting between them. He walked her backward toward his bedroom, his hands everywhere, relearning that she was real and whole and his. When they reached the bed he paused, breathing hard, giving her one last chance to change her mind. "Stay with me," he said, "not just tonight but always. Move into this house, let me take care of you, let me love you the only way I know how, which is completely and possessively and probably too intensely, but I can't help it. You've woken something in me I thought died years ago." "Yes," she breathed, "yes to all of it," and when he lowered her to the bed and covered her body with his, when his hands and mouth mapped every inch of skin he could reach, when she gasped his name like a prayer and he responded with Korean endearments he'd never thought he'd use, it felt like coming home and falling apart simultaneously. The night passed in a haze of sensation and emotion, learning each other's bodies with the desperate intensity of people who'd glimpsed the abyss and chosen each other over safety. When he finally moved over her, into her, the connection was more than physical, it was fundamental, a claiming that went soul deep. Afterward she lay in his arms, her head on his chest listening to his heartbeat while his fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I should warn you," she said quietly, "I'm difficult to love, I have trust issues from my father and body image problems from growing up between cultures, I'm messy and stubborn and I'll probably drive you crazy." "Good," he rumbled, pulling her closer, "I'm controlling and possessive and violent when threatened, I'll want to know where you are every moment, who you're with, what you're doing. I'll probably suffocate you with protection and you'll have to tell me when I'm being too much. We're both damaged, Naomi, but maybe our broken pieces fit together in a way that makes something whole." Morning came too soon. She woke to find him already dressed, standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Korean that sounded tense. When he noticed her awake his expression softened instantly, transforming from crime lord to something almost tender. "Business," he said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed, "nothing you need to worry about. I'm having your things moved from that basement apartment today. You live here now, with me, where I can keep you safe." "That's very presumptuous," she said, but couldn't quite hide her smile. "What if I'm not ready to move in with you after one night?" "Then I'll convince you," he said, kissing her with thorough intensity. "I'm very persuasive when I want something. Besides, you agreed last night, no taking it back now." The following weeks were an adjustment neither of them had expected. Naomi moved into the mansion and immediately began transforming it from a cold showpiece into something that felt like home, adding color and warmth and life to spaces that had been merely functional before. Taeyoon found himself coming home earlier, making excuses to leave meetings so he could watch her cook in his massive kitchen, dancing to music only she could hear. She treated his men with kindness that gradually earned their fierce loyalty. Even Woo Jin admitted she was good for the boss, that something in Taeyoon had softened without losing the edge that kept them all alive. But loving her also meant living with constant fear. Every threat to his organization became a threat to her, every enemy a potential danger, every moment she was out of his sight was torture. He tried to hide it, tried not to be the suffocating presence he'd warned her about, but she saw through him easily. One evening she found him watching security footage of her shopping trip that afternoon, his jaw tight with tension. "You're doing the thing," she said, coming to wrap her arms around him from behind, "the overprotective thing where you forget I'm capable of existing without armed guards." "You had 2 guards, he corrected, "and they're very discreet, you probably didn't even notice them." "I noticed," she laughed, "because I'm not an idiot, but I love you anyway, even when you're being ridiculous." The words hung in the air, the first time either had said them outright rather than implied through actions. He turned in her arms, his hands coming up to frame her face with that gentleness that still surprised her. "Say it again," he demanded softly, his eyes intense on hers. "I love you," she repeated, meeting his gaze steadily. "I love you, Choi Tae-yoon, crime lord, control freak, the man who looks at me like I'm precious and rare. I love all of it, even the parts that probably should scare me." "I love you too," he said, the admission clearly costing him something. "I've never said that to anyone who wasn't blood and meant it the way I mean it with you. You're everything, Naomi, my home and my weakness and my reason for wanting to be better than I am." A few days later the real test came. Naomi's catering company called with opportunity, a massive corporate event that could launch her reputation if she pulled it off successfully, but it meant working late nights for a week and being around wealthy businessmen who would inevitably flirt with her. Taeyoon's first instinct was to forbid it, to keep her safely at home where no other man could look at her wrong, but he saw the excitement in her eyes and bit back the possessive words. "You want to do this," he said, statement not question. "More than anything," she admitted, "this could change everything for my career, but I'll understand if you don't want me to. I know it makes you uncomfortable." "I want you to do it," he forced out, "because your happiness matters more than my comfort, but I'm assigning security, and if any man touches you inappropriately, I'm holding you responsible for keeping me from committing murder." The week was torture for both of them. Naomi threw herself into the work, creating elaborate dishes and coordinating a team, thriving in the organized chaos of professional catering. Taeyoon tried to focus on business but found himself checking the security feeds constantly, watching her laugh with clients and direct her staff, beautiful and confident and completely unaware of how every man in the room tracked her movements. On the third night some executive got too familiar, his hand lingering on her lower back while he complimented her cooking, and Taeyoon's control snapped. He showed up at the event unannounced, appearing at her elbow with that particular energy that made the executive back away with stammered apologies. "We need to talk," Taeyoon said quietly, his hand possessive on her waist. "Not now," she hissed, embarrassed. "I'm working, you can't just show up and intimidate my clients." "I just did," he countered, "and we're having this conversation now, somewhere private." He guided her to an empty conference room despite her protests, his control hanging by a thread. "I can't do this," he said once the door closed. "I can't watch other men touch you and smile through it. I know I promised not to be suffocating, but seeing his hands on you made me want to break every finger he has. Tell me how to be better at this, because right now I'm one jealous comment away from dragging you home and never letting you leave." "You're being ridiculous," she said, but her eyes were soft. He was just a client being friendly. It meant nothing. "It meant something to me," Taeyoon countered, stepping into her space. "You're mine, Naomi. I know that's primitive and probably wrong, but I can't help it. The thought of any man thinking he has a chance with you makes me violent. I'm trying to be supportive, but I'm failing spectacularly." "Then try harder," she said, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "Because I love you, but I won't be caged. I need to work, to have purpose beyond being your protected princess. Trust that I'm yours and I'm choosing you, and no amount of friendly executives will change that." He kissed her then, desperate and claiming, pouring all his frustration and fear and love into the contact until they were both breathless. "I'm sorry," he said against her lips. "I'll work on the jealousy. Just promise me you'll tell me if anyone crosses a line. Let me protect you even if it's just from unwanted attention." "I promise," she said, kissing him again softly. "Now go home and let me finish this event. I'll be back before midnight and we can continue this conversation in more interesting ways." The promise in her voice made heat flash through him, but he forced himself to step back, to let her return to work, to trust that she meant what she said about being his. The event was a massive success, leading to 3 more bookings and industry recognition that had Naomi glowing with pride. Taeyoon celebrated by buying her a professional kitchen space in Gangnam, a studio where she could develop her catering business without the limitations of working from home. "It's too much," she protested, looking at the state-of-the-art equipment. "You can't keep buying me things." "I can and I will," he said, pulling her close, "because your success is my success and I want to give you everything. Let me do this, Naomi. Let me support your dreams the way you support my impossible life." 6 months into their relationship they'd settled into a rhythm that worked despite the insanity of their circumstances. She'd become a fixture in his world, attending events at his side, meeting his associates with a grace that surprised them all, the American-Korean woman who'd somehow tamed the untamable Choi Tae-yoon. His enemies had learned quickly that touching her meant death, his allies that respecting her meant his favor. She'd become powerful in her own right simply by being his. But the danger never fully disappeared. One night they were leaving a charity gala when shots rang out, another attempt on his life that caught them exposed. Taeyoon's body covered hers instantly, shielding her while his security returned fire, and when the smoke cleared she was unharmed, but he'd taken a bullet meant for her. The hospital hours were agony, Naomi pacing the private waiting room while doctors worked to remove the bullet from his shoulder. Woo Jin stood guard, his expression grim. "He'll be fine, boss, he's too stubborn to die," but he's going to be impossible to deal with when he wakes up. He'll probably try to lock you in a tower after this. When Taeyoon finally woke, she was beside his bed, holding his hand with tears streaming down her face. "You took a bullet for me," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have died." "Worth it," he said roughly, his good hand coming up to cup her face. "I told you I'd protect you with everything I have. I meant it. Your life is worth more than mine, Naomi. I'd take 1,000 bullets if it meant keeping you safe." "That's the most beautiful and most infuriating thing anyone's ever said to me," she sobbed. "I love you, but you're never allowed to scare me like this again. Do you understand? I can't lose you, Taeyoon. You've become my whole world." His recovery took weeks, during which she rarely left his side, managing his business from the hospital room, fielding calls and making decisions with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. When he was finally cleared to go home, she'd transformed into something different, no longer just his protected girlfriend but his true partner, someone who understood his world and could operate in it. The shift in their dynamic was subtle but profound. She'd proven she could handle the worst parts of his life, that her love wasn't dependent on him being invincible, that she chose him even when choosing him meant living with constant danger. 1 year after the Christmas party where they met, Taeyoon threw another gathering at the mansion. But this time Naomi stood at his side as hostess rather than catering staff, wearing a diamond on her left hand that announced his intentions to anyone paying attention. He proposed privately, in their bedroom, with a speech about how she'd saved him from becoming the monster everyone thought he was, how loving her had taught him he was still capable of softness, how he wanted to spend the rest of his life protecting her and being protected by her in return. The party was smaller this time, only people they actually cared about, Naomi's close friends and the few associates Taeyoon trusted with their happiness. When midnight approached, he pulled her into a private alcove, away from the crowd, and kissed her with the same desperate intensity of that first night. "Marry me soon," he said against her lips. "I don't want to wait. I want you legally mine in every way possible. Want my ring on your finger and my name attached to yours. Want the whole world to know you're untouchable because you belong to the man who would burn it all down for you." "I thought I already said yes," she laughed, but her eyes were bright with happy tears. "Yes, Taeyoon, I'll marry you as soon as you want, tomorrow if that's what you need." They married 3 months later in a private ceremony that was equal parts traditional Korean and modern American, blending their cultures the way they'd blended their lives. The guest list was small, the security extensive, but the vows were real and raw and full of promises about forever. When he kissed his bride, Choi Taeyoon felt something he'd never experienced: complete peace, the bone-deep certainty that he'd found the one person who could love all of him, the darkness and light, the violence and tenderness, the man who killed without hesitation and the man who would die for her without question. 6 months after the wedding, Naomi appeared in his office with a nervous smile and a piece of paper clutched in her hands. "We need to talk," she said, and his heart stopped until he saw the joy in her eyes. "I'm pregnant, Taeyoon. We're going to have a baby. I know we didn't plan this and your world is dangerous, but I want this. I want our child. Tell me you want this too." He was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with a reverence that spoke louder than words. "I want everything with you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A baby, a family, a life that's more than just survival. You've given me that, Naomi. You've given me a reason to want to be better, to build something good instead of just maintaining power. Our child will grow up knowing they're loved and protected and part of something beautiful their parents built together." The pregnancy transformed him in ways she hadn't expected. The feared crime lord became obsessive about her health, attending every doctor appointment, researching everything from prenatal nutrition to car seat safety with the same intensity he applied to business. His men found it hilarious until they saw the look in his eyes when anyone suggested she was being coddled, then they wisely kept their amusement to themselves. Naomi bloomed under his attention, her body changing in ways that made him worship her even more, the visual proof of their love growing inside her, making him impossibly tender and fiercely protective simultaneously. When their daughter was born on a snowy December night, almost exactly 2 years after they'd met, Taeyoon held her with shaking hands and felt his heart crack open in entirely new ways. She had Naomi's eyes and his stubborn chin, perfect and tiny and utterly dependent on them, and he understood suddenly why his own father had been so ruthless in protecting their family. "This," he said, looking between his wife and daughter, "this is what I've been building toward without knowing it. not power or money or fear, but this moment, this family, this love that makes everything else seem meaningless in comparison. 5 years later their home was loud with children's laughter, their daughter joined by a son who had Naomi's smile and Taeyoon's intensity. The mansion had been fully transformed, no longer a showplace but a home filled with art projects and toy dinosaurs and the organized chaos of family life. Taeyoon had gradually transitioned his organization toward legitimate businesses, using his power to protect rather than exploit, building something his children could inherit without shame. He was still dangerous, still commanded respect through fear when necessary, but the man who came home every night to his family was someone different, someone Naomi's love had helped him become. On Christmas Eve they stood together watching their children decorate a tree, her back against his chest and his arms around her waist, his hand resting protectively on the slight swell of her stomach where their third child grew. "Did you ever imagine this," she asked, "when you saw me that first night at the party, that it would lead to this, to us, to everything we've built?" "No," he admitted, kissing her temple, "I imagined wanting you, keeping you, claiming you in every way possible, but I never imagined you'd transform me so completely, that you'd take the broken violent man I was and love him into being someone capable of this kind of happiness. You saved me, Naomi, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," she said, turning in his arms to look up at him. "You gave me safety and love and a family when I'd lost everything. You showed me that dangerous men can be dangerous for the people they love rather than to them, that protection can feel like freedom when it comes from the right person. I love you, Choi Tae-yoon, my Christmas miracle. The man who found me when I didn't know I was lost and refused to let me go even when letting go would have been easier." Their children called them to help with the tree and they moved together, a unit, partners in parenting the way they were partners in everything. That night after the kids were in bed they sat by the window watching snow fall over Seoul, his hand linked with hers, her head on his shoulder, and Taeyoon thought about that Christmas party 2 years ago when his carefully controlled world had tilted sideways. He'd been prepared for anything that night except her, except the way she'd looked at him with fear and fascination in equal measure, except the way she'd awakened something in him he'd thought died long ago, except the way she'd chosen to love him anyway despite every logical reason not to. Some people would say their story was impossible, that men like him didn't get happy endings, that relationships built on danger and obsession couldn't last. But sitting there with his wife and their growing family, the woman who'd changed everything sleeping peacefully in their room, Taeyoon knew they were wrong. Love wasn't about perfect circumstances or logical choices, it was about finding someone who saw your darkness and chose to bring light anyway, about building something beautiful in the midst of chaos, about protecting what mattered with everything you had and being protected in return. He'd found all that and more in a woman he'd spotted across a Christmas party ballroom, the one person in the world who could look at the monster everyone feared and see the man beneath who just wanted to be worthy of her love. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, she'd chosen him anyway, and that choice had saved them both.